this Sunday, and many churches around the world with various traditions, they begin these 5 weeks of gospel readings from John chapter 6. And it's really focused on one of Jesus' main statements, where he says, "I am the bread of life." Some preachers, they dread the seemingly redundancy of this every 3-year breadapalooza or bread tide. Yeah. We're going to call it the gospel according to bread. I'm sorry, you gluten-free people out there, but we're going to spend some time with some bread. But here's the gist: if you're going to miss a week or what have you, this is what Jesus is going to say. And I'm going to condense it all so you can save some time. Jesus said, "I am the bread of life. Again, I say to you, I am the bread of life. Let those with ears to hear know that I am the bread of life. Verily, I say to you, I am the bread of life. Would you like a side of bread with your bread of life?" My bread and butter is being the bread of life, better bread than dead. I'm the best bread of life since sliced bread. You know where your bread of life is buttered. I am the bread of life. Now, truthfully, there is something significant going on here, and it's more than just repetition, right? All of this starts not with some lofty teaching, but with an experience. And it starts with the feeding of the 5,000. And we've heard that in other Gospels probably within this last year, maybe a time or two. Well, that's okay. John gets it or writes it a little bit differently. So let's hear these words from John chapter 6, verses 1 through 21. Let's hear the word of the Lord. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. And Jesus went up the mountain, and he sat down there with his disciples. And now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. And when he looked up and he saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" And he said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. And Philip answered him, 200 denarii would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. And one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" And Jesus said, "Now make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. And Jesus took those loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, and also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. And when the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." And then the evening came, and his disciples went down to the sea, and they got in a boat and started across the sea to Capernaum. Now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them, and the sea became rough, because a strong wind was blowing. And when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat. And they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." And they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. This is the word of God for God's people today. Thanks be to God. You know, if you ever take some time to read the Gospels, you'll notice that John marches to the beat of his own drum in retelling the story of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all share a lot in common. Of course, they have their own perspective, their own audience, and they were who they were specifically writing to, and each of them highlighted particular threads woven into their retelling, what they wanted the hearer and the reader to see very clearly. But John had a different approach. Instead of trying to capture it all, the writer of John wanted to make sure there was a particular structure, a particular rhythm, in helping us discover this important fact that Jesus is God. That Jesus is sent to us, God in the flesh, and Jesus is the very glory of who God is. That Jesus is the living Word of God, who is the light which exposes the darkness. And this whole book of John is structured not so much about when things happen in Jesus' ministry, but ordered in such a way they show us who Jesus is. And these miracles, or the signs in John, there's 7 of them, and there's also 7 I am teachings. And they're highlighted by John, and they're meticulously chosen and explained with a very deliberate purpose. And so the sign that we experience, this miracle, is the feeding of the 5,000. And the other 6 in John's gospel, they follow a pattern as well. And this is how it works. Very simple. Jesus performs the miracle, and then Jesus follows it up by teaching on it. Jesus was a good teacher. He's more than that, but he was a good teacher. And Jesus had what teachers might call, Denise, might call a good pedagogy, right? A good method of teaching, right? We got some teachers in there. Carly, you probably studied some pedagogy in your classes. It's about the method. How are we going to teach? Can people follow along? Is it going to stick in their brain? The lessons that stick with us are those that are grounded in experience, right? I had one of my favorite teachers in high school was Coach Tuck. And Coach Tuck taught physics. Now, I'm not a science person, and I'm not a smart person, but he would find ways to help us get our hands physically on the material. And let me tell you about one of the experiments we had. So he had tied a tennis ball to the middle of the room, and it was hanging on this hook with a rope. And so what we had to do was we had to take the tennis ball, and we had to back ourselves to the wall and put that tennis ball right on our nose. And then we had to let go. And we couldn't move our hands. We had to keep our hands by our side, and we had to watch that tennis ball swing on the pendulum and come right back at us in the face. Now, the trick was you weren't supposed to blink as the ball returned. But the neat little thing about that experiment was that it's not going to return to the same place. It's going to lose a little bit of its velocity, momentum. I don't remember physics very well. I remember the experiment. I don't remember what he was trying to teach us, what it was called. But I know that the ball would not quite return to its initial place. There was some energy lost in that. There's some friction where it tied. Well, I'm not going to get into that. This is not a physics lesson. It's more of a lesson in bread. But getting back to it, Christ's act and teaching, though, and all of these signs, particularly in this one, they're more than a skilled method. Some of the deepest truths just can't merely be talked about. They must be embodied. And that was exactly what was happening on the hillside. I received a book in the mail. It was called Dude, You're Gonna Be a Dad. And it was a book that was sent to me once we knew that Camille was on the way. And yeah, you. And I read that book with excitement and joy, and I devoured everything that it had in its pages, and then I started to fear. I feared because each passing day was the reality that life is about to change. And I read more deeply about the changes that were going to happen to Sarah's body and within Sarah's body, and how we were going to have to change things around the house, how we had to get things safe. We had to put those little plug things in the holes so they wouldn't electrocute themselves, and all this stuff. We had to prepare the house. I read how sleep was going to be different. It was and is. What to expect changing diapers. The copious amounts of things that happen when they grow. And that idea of new life coming into our family was amazing. But any soon-to-be father would also wonder, can I do this? Am I going to mess this up? Am I going to be good enough? Am I going to love and care and provide and keep them safe well? And as good as that book was, and I would recommend it, Dude, You're Going to Be a Dad, there's no amount of reading, there's no ink on the page that could capture the overwhelming love of seeing the miracle of birth and holding that precious part of you for the first time. And dealing with all that would come, some things just have to be embodied and experienced. You know, pictures aren't good enough. Seeing a picture of something or an art piece in a textbook, nothing can capture the real majesty and majestic handiwork of a place like the Grand Canyon or a giant redwood. Nothing comes close to being face to face with the real thing and being able to encounter awe. The same can be said of swimming. I know we're watching the Olympics. You can know what a swimmer should do. Like, you got to, breathe and all that. But it's different when you get into the water. Any sport, it's easy for us to sit at home on the sofa and analyze the pitcher's choice of what they're going to throw next, or yell across the soccer pitch from the sideline. But being in the game, doing the thing, making it happen, that's where real experience is the teacher. So when have you had an experience like that? One that taught you something a book just couldn't quite get at. An experience that embodied a deep truth. When he fed the 5,000, Jesus gave a deep truth, a bodily experience. With coarse barley loaves and a couple of fish, with real food passed from hand to hand with chewing and swallowing and very few words. And I imagine there were skeptics in the crowd and even doubt, and eventually all. Jesus embodied what it meant to be the bread of life. In the next 4 weeks, we're going to get plenty of insight of what the bread of life means. But this week, I just want us to, as a congregation, to dwell in what the bread of life feels and smells and tastes and looks like and sounds like. Each day, I want you, this is homework, so it's school season, so I'm giving you homework. Each day, I want you to take time and reflect, where have I experienced Jesus? Where have I seen with my eyes God at work? What did I hear that captured a movement of God's grace? What circumstance or storm did Jesus suddenly show up and be present for and brought peace? In what ways is Jesus bringing satisfaction? Verse 12 says, and they were satisfied. In what ways is Jesus, you experienced with your own eyes and hands and ears, where is Jesus satisfying you? We live in a world that no one seems to be satisfied. Nothing's good enough, but we have something that they don't, and we want them to know. Just like bread that's taken and broken and given to the neighbor. We have something worth sharing. And so I'm giving you homework. This is just like a thought for the day, and I'm going to go home and forget. I want us to literally come back next week, and I want you to share an encounter with someone else in this church. How, when, what was going on, where you encountered and experienced God at work. I want you to share. I want you to text me, email, call me, come visit me. I want you to talk to your Sunday school people, Sunday school classes. I want you to allow time for 3 different people to share. Where did they experience God at work? And here's why we're going to do this, church. This is why. Because discipleship and following Jesus isn't about what we do right here on Sunday morning. This is the place where we come and connect and worship. But the Christian life, the life of a follower, a disciple of Jesus, it takes place out there in the midst of life, in the midst of the wind blowing and the storm coming. And that storm could be anything. It could be a marriage. It could be a church. It could be a bad experience at school. But Jesus will show up, and Jesus will provide. I want you to go and capture that experience just like John captures it for us and presents to us today. Don't overthink it. Just find a way to capture it, to tell it. Jesus comes into those ordinary places of life. There's things that we can see, touch, smell, and know. And we come to the table in the same way. We come and we take a piece of bread and we share the cup. Those are things that we do every day. And Jesus also gives us the gift of baptism. This ordinary thing, water, what we need to live. And it's in this experience we're called to something just as holy.